Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka. In the 1980s, when Czechoslovakia was still under communist rule, even the exchange of ideas could be an act of defiance. Today, I bring you a story of one quiet network of solidarity, the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, that connected Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who were not happy with the state of things, with mainly British academics and writers who were determined to help. Among them was Barbara Day, a British writer and theatre historian who often travelled to communist Czechoslovakia and exchanged information and materials under the watchful eye of the secret police.
In the corridors of the National Theatre. I would visit someone in one office and then I'd slip out of one end of the office when I'd finished, and my real contact would slip out to the other end of the office and we'd meet and exchange materials, and no one would be the wiser because it all took place just in a few minutes in the corridor.
The story of Barbara Day and many others like her is now told in Sparks of Freedom, a new exhibition at Brno's Moravian Museum. It celebrates the courage of people who kept philosophy, education and independent thought alive when free expression was forbidden. Another voice in that story is Nancy Durham, a Canadian journalist who reported from Czechoslovakia in those years, helped the foundation and explains why its legacy still matters now in 2025.
Human rights and freedom are a struggle around the world and in a very big way now on different continents. And I think it tells you that if you do something small, it can really make a difference.
In the next about half hour you will also hear that for Barbara Day, helping the Jan Hus Foundation was not only an act of solidarity, it was a deeply personal mission.
To be able to do something concrete for people like this was a privilege. I just thought how lucky we had been in our education in Britain, and that I wanted to put something back.
So, the following episode of Czechast brings you the stories of these two women that are about courage, empathy and belief in the power of education and free exchange of ideas.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Before we delve into my discussion with Barbara Day, here's a little introduction. She was born in Britain during World War II, the daughter of a teacher and an Anglican priest. She grew up in a vicarage in Sheffield, went to boarding school and later studied drama at the University of Manchester. In the mid-1960s, she came to Czechoslovakia on a scholarship and found herself in Prague again during the dramatic days of the 1968 invasion. After working in theatres in London and other English cities, she returned to academia to pursue a PhD in Bristol, where she helped organise a major Czech cultural festival called Bristol Czechast in 1985. She became deeply involved with the Jan Hus Educational Foundation from the mid-1980s. For quite a few years, she managed to operate and literally smuggle free thinking into a totalitarian state. These days, Barbara lives in Prague, where she works as a translator, university lecturer and author. And this is how she would describe the work of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation to people who might never have heard about it.
Well, it was created in response to a letter from one of the Czech philosophers who'd been thrown out of the university during the purges that followed the Russian invasion. We're talking about the 1970s. And he went on teaching in his flat, and he was teaching his some of his original students, together with some young people who were forbidden to go to university because their parents were politically involved. And he came to the conclusion after several years that he taught them all that he could teach them. And he wrote a letter to Western universities, 4 Western universities, inviting them to come and lecture at his secret seminar in Prague. I should say underground seminar in Prague, because the professor was called Julius Tomin, and he insisted on the right to open education and not doing anything secretly. So he had students who were taking a very big risk when they came to him. He taught philosophy, Plato, the Greek philosophers, but he wanted something more for his students, and his letter reached Oxford. And the philosophers in Oxford discussed it and said, but of course, if a colleague of ours wants help, then it's our duty to help them, and we will send a lecturer to Prague. And the lecturer they chose from among the Oxford dons, from among the Oxford philosophers, was Cathy Wilkes from St Hilda's College. She came to Prague in 1979, for Easter 1979, and was overwhelmed by the people she met and the quality of discussion at the seminar she taught in, and came back and encouraged the Oxford philosophers to go on helping and sending lecturers to these philosophy seminars.
I don't want to surprise you by this question, it just came up to my mind. Roughly how many professors, how many philosophers from Britain or some other countries came to Czechoslovakia, just roughly? Are we talking about dozens, individuals?
Gosh, well, I know that later on we had the seminar in Brno, and we had at least 100 lecturers visit that. So I suppose Prague, Brno and Bratislava combined, it must have been over 200.
That's very impressive. How did you personally become involved with the Jan Hus Foundation? How did it come about?
Through the theatre. Because theatre in Czechoslovakia as it was, Czech Republic as it now is, was very influential. And people took a lot of notice of and still do take a lot of notice of what goes on in the theatre. And there was one particular company based in Brno that at the time I was doing theatre research, and I wanted to bring them over to England. I knew that the work they were doing was very original and very significant in the Czech Republic at the time. And so I actually, with the help of the British Council, or the Visiting Arts Unit of the British Council, I set up a festival in Bristol, at Bristol University, called the Bristol Czechast. And it was during that the dramaturg of the theatre, Petr Osselsley, suggested to the people he was working with in Britain, there are two things going on here. There's the theatre and there's the underground seminars. Peter was involved in both. I was involved in the theatre, and people like Cathy Wilkes, Alan Montefiore, Ralph Walker, the philosophy professors, were involved in the other side of Petr's work. So Petr decided to bring this together as we were all in Britain together, and actually suggested to the philosophers that I could work for them. And that was how it began.
And then it went on for years and years to come.
Well, the remaining years of the 1980s, my festival was in 1985, and I carried on working with the underground seminars until, of course, the end of '89. And then we founded a or our colleagues, we didn't do it, but our colleagues, the Czechs and Slovaks, founded a Czechoslovak existence of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation.
And so, just briefly, what changed? How did it operate after 1989?
Well, you probably remember the situation when everyone was pouring into the country, trying to do good things. And we were trying to maintain our original principles, which was to teach philosophy and other subjects, but to bring innovative education, innovative projects. And one change was that we began to support the teaching of law, because under communism, the teaching was very one-sided, one could say.
To put it mildly. I actually remember Roger Scruton coming to Olomouc, where I was a student, back very early in 1990, I think.
Yes.
And he had a lecture on the rule of law, and it made me realize how ignorant we were, growing up under communism, what the rule of law really means, even though it may sound kind of so obvious today. So I totally understand, and I think you did a great job. And personal disclaimer, I got my first batch of English teaching books from Jan Hus Foundation back in 1990.
I remember your application.
Yeah. So I benefited greatly from your work, I have to say. If I can just ask you, what did it give you personally, working for an institution like Jan Hus Foundation?
Oh, it was a joy. It fulfilled something that I'd been wanting to do ever since I'd first become involved with the Czech Republic. Because working on the theatre research, I had been, in the first part of the 1980s, meeting such amazing people who had been crushed and marginalised, sacked from their jobs, forced to take menial jobs. Some of them were sweeping floors, some of them were cleaning boilers. And to be able to do something concrete for people like this was a privilege. I just thought how lucky we had been in our education in Britain, and that I wanted to put something back, and especially to these people who were working against such great odds. I made an awful lot of interviews during that period, during the period of my research, and very often they took place not in the conventional place for an interview, but behind the Vratnica of a college or a hotel, or through a dressing room mirror, some of my interviews. And where else did I? Oh, in the corridors of the National Theatre. I would visit someone in one office, and then I'd slip out of one end of the office when I'd finished, and my real contact would slip out of the other end of the office, and we'd meet and exchange materials, and no one would be the wiser, because it all took place just in a few minutes in the corridor.
Sounds like a spy film or novel even sometimes.
But it was really perfectly ordinary. I think I'd say about myself that I'm an amateur, that I fall in love, and I fell in love with this country and the people, and somehow never got free of it.
And we should perhaps note for the listeners that amateur comes from the French amateur meaning lover, basically. You fell in love with Czechoslovakia and Czechia, I suppose.
Yes, but I had no professional training for what I was doing. I had to pick it up on the job. I tried to be as professional as I could, especially in things like confidentiality. That was very important. I know there were some people working as couriers who saw it as all as a game, but I didn't see it as a game. I saw it as a job that had to be done, and it had to be done as efficiently as it could.
Why Czechoslovakia? Why Czech culture? Why Czech theatre? How did it all start?
That was all an accident, actually, because in my first year at university, where I was studying drama in Manchester, we had a visit to the International Student Festival in Parma. And there was a company there who arrived late because they'd been held up on the border. And we were all waiting and waiting for these Czechs, because we knew they were coming from Czechoslovakia. And thinking, poor things, they're going to be absolutely tired and worn out. And when they arrived, they were full of energy and full of creativity. It was the best part of the festival.
So which ensemble was it, sorry, just to mention that, from Czechoslovakia that came?
What I didn't realise until much, much later was that they weren't Czechs at all, they were Slovaks. They were from Shemu, including Marianne Labuda, Emilia Vašáriová, a particularly bright year among the Slovak students. So the people I fell in love with originally were not Czech at all.
So how did it develop?
Well, the following year I was in France, not for theatre, but on a work camp. And we were Dutch, Belgian, French, Swedish, about 10 different nationalities. And there again, there were 2 Czechs. So having been interested already the first year, my first year as a student, I particularly wanted to talk to these 2 Czechs. One of them was from Moravia and the other was from Prague. And we stayed in touch for, well, one of them I'm still in touch with. We still meet, still visit occasionally.
In one of the interviews that I read, you've said that theatre in Czechoslovakia was regarded as a serious, respected profession, quite unlike Britain at that time. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, in Britain, theatre has always been peripheral, or at least in my time it has. If you were interested in theatre, you looked anxiously for people who had a similar interest, because you weren't so likely to find them in your own family or you're in class at school. I remember having to argue very hard for the importance of theatre in one of my lessons at school. Whereas when I got here, I discovered that everyone went to the theatre. Maybe it was the Carlene Music Theatre, or maybe it was one of the young small stages that had sprung up, or maybe it was the National Theatre or the opera. Very often it was all of these. And I could start a conversation about theatre just with someone I'd met 5 minutes previously. There wasn't any need to introduce who the great actors were, who the great singers were. And then I began to realise that, particularly when I was studying in the 1980s, that this had an influence on their lives, that the students who went to performances by Theatre on a String took them really seriously and would discuss them long afterwards. And that's something that doesn't really happen in England, or not very often.
That's true, and after all, in 1989, actors together with students were the kind of the spark that started the changes.
Yes, that was like the great culmination of all their work up to then. It all came together in 1989.
But if we can come back to especially the 1970s, when Czechoslovakia was going through what we call normalization after the invasion of 1968, and even in the 1980s, you were in touch with a lot of people in Czechoslovakia. You had to travel back and forth, I presume.
Yes.
And we are talking about Cold War, travel restrictions, secret police. What was it like to work, under those conditions?
Well, I began my research in 1980. I was here in the 1960s, but after the invasion, then I grew away from... I was doing other things for about 10 years. Then I came back in 1980. Maybe it was the inspiration of Charter 77. And I found that people were mostly with me, they were very open, which was quite surprising. It was almost as though they could talk to me when they couldn't talk to their fellow Czechs in some cases. And not only people who were, I don't want to use the word dissidents because I've got a dislike of that term, but not only among people who were opposed to communism, even some convinced communists would talk to me about their experiences. So that was a very strange thing for me. And I mentioned confidentiality earlier in our conversation. And I knew from the beginning that I had to be confidential I had to handle carefully the information that I was given. But when I started working for the Jan Hus Foundation, that came much higher on the list, because I really had to be very careful then, not only because there was a tendency once you got on the plane and were on the way to Heathrow, that you were out of the sphere of influence. And I realised that it wasn't even safe in London. You could be followed and your mail could be watched, even if you were thinking you were safely at home.
But obviously by the communist secret police, or spies basically, probably operating from the embassy mostly.
Yes, I found letters that had been written to me and posted in Czechoslovakia in the STB file when I had a chance to see it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What were perhaps surprises, in the file when you had the possibility to look into it?
Well, my own file had been destroyed. You probably know that very many files were destroyed in the months of November and December.
Immediately after the fall of communism. Yeah.
And starting in some cases even before the fall of communism, when they knew it was going to happen. But what has survived is a file on the Jan Hus Educational Foundation. And in that I found a letter from a friend in the jazz section about the trials of 1986 and what the results had been. And that must have been removed during the period of sorting in Czechoslovakia and never reached me.
Does that give you kind of pause for thought even now in 2025? Whether there might be some materials, that got to people that might, I don't know, be used, or why, they were destroyed?
I'd love to know why they let me go on working and visiting.
Because they knew about
Czechoslovakia. Yes, maybe that was it. Other people I knew suddenly had their visa refused. Yes. There was just once when I went into the embassy to get a visa for what was a tourist trip, and they said, come back tomorrow. And I thought, it started. And I went back the next day expecting to have it refused. Oh yes, they'd said, we've got to consult Prague. I came back the next day and they handed me the visa over the counter.
Was it all worth it when I'm asking about your work, about Jan Hus Foundation and your cooperation with, Czech theatre and everything? And I suppose the answer seems pretty obvious to you. But nevertheless, let me ask you, was it worth it? And if so, why?
Well, it was for me personally. I felt that I was living in a real world that I would never have experienced if I'd just taken, say, an office or a teaching job. It was difficult very often. It was often financially very difficult. And I think what came out of it was that we knew how to work with minimum resources and how to use people and trust people. I mean, when I say how to use them, how to deploy them, how to cooperate, how to develop networks. Because in Moravia, thanks a lot to Petr Osselsley, and I should mention Jerzy Miller, it was Jerzy Miller and Roger Scruton who thought out the seminar in Moravia, right from original principles, and the way they worked and the way the network expanded from philosophy to include political science, music, ecology, art. I'm missing a lot out, but there was a real network and international network, not only British people working with Czechs and Slovaks, but also people from Canada, America, Germany, France. France was very important at this time. And it all began with the letter that Julius Tomin had written.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and after speaking to Barbara, I met another woman who bravely helped spread freedom of thought and free press in communist Czechoslovakia, Nancy Durham.
I'm Canadian, but I'm an immigrant. I live in the UK. I've been there since 1984 and spent my whole career as a journalist, traveling really around the world, mostly around Europe and the former Soviet bloc, but also Africa, Iraq, all across the Balkans during the war there. And I spent a lot of time here in the 1980s.
Why here?
Well, my husband, Bill Newton-Smith, my late husband, was expelled from Czechoslovakia in 1980 for giving a philosophy lecture in Prague illegally. And it was probably one of the greatest things the Czech police ever could have done, because it was front page news around the world. And it shone a light on the fact that you needed to have permission to talk philosophy and more, play music, make a pot, make a statement. So anyway, Bill got kicked out. I met him about a year later, and he couldn't come back, but I could. So I used all his contacts. So I came and went in the 80s, making stories about people who were associated with the jazz section and other people. And it was a very exciting place to come for a journalist.
So you were here mainly on writing assignments, or were you smuggling some materials for Jan Hus Foundation as well?
I brought typewriter ribbons to Václav Havel.
Oh, really?
Yes, right to his house. And I probably brought a book or messages about who the next visitor might be. I did talk. I wasn't really a lecturer, but I'd been to China recently, so I spoke in a room about my experience of being in China as a journalist in the mid-'80s. But I functioned, I think, as sort of as a normal journalist, I came on an official visa, so I had to see lots of men in very gray suits, but then I could go out and about and do my own thing and see who I liked. Until the very end of the 80s, I started getting followed all the time, and I couldn't go to anybody's door safely anymore.
What did it feel like? What was the feeling, when you realized that you were being followed?
Scary. I'm not really brave. And the major couple of days where I was being followed, it was a tale where you're supposed to know that you're being followed. It freaks you out. I was on the underground, and I started to sense I was being followed, so I got off the train and right back on again, and so did the man who I thought was following me. So it was cat and mouse all the way to Wenceslas Square. And finally I met a diplomat in a church. I phoned the Canadian embassy, and a diplomat met me in the back of a church, sort of cheered me up and said not to worry, and I was leaving town anyway, so that was the end of that assignment.
Just for the benefit of the listeners, what we are hearing are the bells of the Petrov Cathedral, I believe, here on the hill.
And how lovely they are. Very nice.
They definitely are.
Yeah.
But Nancy and I decided to wait a little before continuing so that the majestic bells of Brno's Petrov wouldn't get too much in the way of our conversation.
Here we are, 2025. Why is it important? Why is it relevant now in 2025 to remind people, to help people understand what it was about?
Human rights and freedom are a struggle around the world and in a very big way now on different continents. And I think it tells you that if you do something small, it can really make a difference. We were very few people coming in and meeting people. We didn't have an internet, so we had no way to send a message out to everyone, yet still the word got out. So it is really important to say something, do something, share a book with somebody, and not think it won't matter. Actually, I find it really exciting because, you know, the internet is just like this giant freebie now, which causes great things and problematic things. But I think small actions can change governments.
What are the things that I didn't ask about and you would like to mention?
It's sort of along the same lines, because when I came in November 1989, I came a couple of weeks ahead of the Velvet Revolution. And it was dark in the daylight and at night, and there were a lot of police. They were acting like thugs sometimes, and it felt very tight and very closed. And there was this story going around about there was going to be a demonstration, a march on a Friday afternoon. I think it was a Friday, maybe wrong, up at the university. Was it? And is it Jan Hus was the student?
Yeah, that was the student.
It was in memory of his
it was
death.
In his memory because he was killed by the Nazis back in 1939.
Yeah, and I remember my news editor saying, because there wasn't a lot happening, and my news editor saying, why don't you stay for that? You know, stay, don't come back. And so I stayed, and I went up to the march, and it was so cold. And there were very few people standing around, like just a few. And then there were more than a few, and then a few more than a few. And of course, we started walking. I wasn't part of a march, I'm a journalist with my recorder asking people questions and going along. And we just picked up hundreds and thousands of people as we marched. And I remember walking beside a man who said to me, you know, this is not a revolution, it's an uprising. And it was. There was an actress in the National Theatre waving up at us from people. The trams were blocked, and people were waving from the trams, and some getting off and joining the march. And then pretty soon we were in, is it Narodny?
Narodny Street,
Narodny Street, like sardine, crammed in there. And there were police here and there, and there were some ugly moments, but it had begun, and it carried on. I mean, that was the beginning of the uprising, and I'm so thrilled that I was there for that. And of course, I stood outside every day and night for the next, I don't know how many days it took, freezing cold. The woman on the Esplanade reception gave me her boots. You know, somebody else gave me a sweater, and I was fortified against the cold. Sorry, you want to go.
So that was Barbara Day and Nancy Durham, two women whose quiet courage helped keep freedom of thought and education alive in communist Czechoslovakia. Their work with the Jan Hus Educational Foundation reminds us that even small acts of solidarity can have lasting power. Thank you for listening to Czechast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like or follow the podcast. It helps us reach more listeners and bring you more stories like these. And please don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Prague Off the Beaten Track, where I explore the lesser-known corners of the Czech capital and the history of people behind them. If you have thoughts or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. Just write an email or leave a note wherever you listen. I'm Vít Pohanka, stay curious, stay safe, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.